In 10 minutes. Oh, okay. Oh, so welcome everyone to the second teaching on Introduction to Buddhist Meditation and Philosophy. And we're very, very grateful. We have here with us Venerable Gache, who is a student at the Seraje Monastic University and has taken time from the busy schedule that all the students there have to come here and spend the weekend with us. Very grateful for that, Venerable Gache. And welcome to all the people online. The recordings will be put online later, and I hope you all have a good day.
Thank you everyone for coming. So we can start with some basic prayers. We do page 34 in this full book with some simple prayers. I go for refuge until I am enlightened through the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Supreme Assembly. In my practice of giving and other perfections, may I become a Buddha to benefit all sentient beings. I go for refuge until I am enlightened through the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Supreme Assembly. In my practice of giving and other perfections, and become a Buddha to benefit all sentient beings. I go for refuge until I am enlightened, the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Supreme Assembly. My practice of giving and other perfections may become a Buddha to benefit all sentient beings. May all sentient beings have happiness and the causes of happiness. May all sentient beings be free from suffering and the causes of suffering. May all sentient beings be inseparable from the happiness that is without, that is free from suffering. May all sentient beings abide in equanimity, free from attachment for friends and hatred for enemies. Reverently, I prostrate with my body, speech, and mind. I present clouds of every type of offering, actual and imagined. I declare all my negative actions accumulated since beginningless time, and rejoice in the merit of all holy and ordinary beings. Please remain till the end of cyclic existence, and turn the wheel of Dharma for living beings. I dedicate my own and others' merits to and those of others to the great enlightenment. This ground anointed with perfume, strewn with flowers, the dome of Mount Meru, pour continents, the sun and the moon. I imagine this is a Buddha field and operate. May all living beings enjoy this pure land. Idam Guru Dana Mandala Kamnardiyatayami. Due to the merits, oh, that's the dedication verse. So why don't we just begin? We'll start just sit quietly for a few minutes so we can come fully present here. Okay, so let's begin. Levin came here last week and he described to me a little bit about what he talked about. So it seems we're doing introduction to a number of basic Buddhist topics. I looked at the list. It's quite a broad introduction. So today our topics will be mind and mental factors, the Four Noble Truths, the three vehicles and the three scopes, and then the Lamrim. So I think the first three of those, we could probably spend several months on each of them. For the fourth one, we could spend several years. So we'll condense them all to about 15 minutes. Give a general idea what these are. And maybe in the future, if you're interested, you can continue to look into these. So first, mind and mental factors. So in Buddhism, of course, our main focus is on mind. What is mind? This is still a major question in science and among philosophers. It's not something that's been resolved very easily. Buddhism also has a description of the physical world, which is worth noting. It has some very interesting observations and ways of thinking about things. But at the same time, I think the modern understanding of physical reality, at least on a conventional level, has far surpassed what was developed by ancient cultures. However, in terms of the understanding of the mind, it's not quite the same. We have modern psychology and cognitive science, which have made some very good strides, in my opinion, from looking at it, both in terms of understanding the functions of consciousness and the mind. And not just we say mind, we also can talk about the sense powers and sense consciousness, and then conceptual mind and other understandings of the mental consciousness. And also in terms of clinical psychology, which is something that we don't see so much of in the ancient texts. Now, in the ancient texts, in some sense, clinical psychology is meant to be applied to everybody. It's not at all pure theory. It's meant for immediate application. However, it's focused mainly on ordinary, well-adjusted people who want to transform their minds in a very deep way, rather than modern clinical psychology is, to a large extent, although not always, focused on pathology, people who have some kind of mental, abnormal psychology, we could say, and then trying to help them return to what was called normalcy. Whereas in Buddhist philosophy, what is called normalcy is probably better than pathology, but is still not really mentally healthy. And we still want to achieve something beyond that, which is not something we can do so much with the body, with the physical body. If we have a physical illness, we want to restore it to normal health. But beyond that, nobody really talks about wanting to become invulnerable or live forever. Well, some people actually do talk about this these days, but I haven't seen any of them successful so far. And in Buddhist philosophy, it's not the main focus. There is a little bit of talk about this in terms of very advanced levels of realization, but it's unclear whether it's really efficacious, and it's not really the main point anyway. It shouldn't be the goal of practice. So anyway, I think it's good to compare a little bit the ancient Buddhist understanding of mind with what is to I would say what is understood today is probably not quite the right word, because there are many different theories nowadays. But some of the currently accepted theories and some of the currently um, commonly held views about the nature of consciousness and then functions of mind. We can't spend, again, in 15 minutes, we can't cover that exhaustively, but it's good to because when we hear about the ancient teaching, it might just sound like some words that refer to something that we can't quite place, but when we can compare it to something that we're familiar with, it's a little easier. So one of the main differences, it would seem, and we say mind and mental factors immediately with that title, we can see that Buddhist philosophy is focused, and to a large extent, on a bottom-up approach, we could say, to the nature of mind. So we look at the individual moments of mind. So when we say mind, sometimes we think mind just refers to some large generality. My mind, your mind. I have a small mind or a large mind. My mind is uncomfortable. So we talk about it as though it's a singular thing. And we might not even think about reflectively what is the difference between mind and self. Is there a difference? Sometimes we just think, well, we say my mind. If we say my mind, it already implies that we somehow consider them separate things. So this is a major focus in Buddhist philosophy also. So we talk about mind and mental factors. It's a little bit similar to the way that when Buddhism talks about the material world, it talks about it in terms of particles. It's made up of particular particles. So that's some parallel with the modern scientific understanding of physical reality as being broken down into constituent parts. So likewise here with mind. So in Buddhism, the word mind can also be plural. A single person can have multiple minds. Most specifically, the person has 6 consciousnesses, it's called. And consciousness here is actually synonymous with mind. We shouldn't confuse them as 2 different things, whereas in modern presentations, they're sometimes considered separate, or at least distinct. So we have of course, the eye consciousness, the ear consciousness, nose, tongue, body consciousness. These are all called sense consciousnesses. And then the mental consciousness. These are all functioning simultaneously. And they all have what's called main mind. So in this context of mind and mental factors, mind is synonymous with main mind. It's not a general statement. And then we have mental factors that accompany those. So we have the main visual consciousness, the main auditory consciousness, and so forth. Each of those have their own main mind. So then that main mind is accompanied by mental factors. What we mean by main mind is essentially the mere factor of being cognition. And what that means, very simply in Buddhist philosophy, is what is clear and knowing. Those are the 2 characteristics that make something mine. Whereas what is a physical thing, we could say is what is obstructive. Now, literally the word in Tibetan, zuk, it translates rupa from Sanskrit, and I'm not sure of the etymology of the rupa. With zuk in Tibetan, it's actually it's an abbreviated form of the word zukja. Zuk is in Tibetan, it's the particle of the verb zuk, which means to point to something. The zuk cha would mean something you can point to. Something out there I can see. There's form. You can't do that with mind. You cannot point. Where is your mind? And sometimes people will say, well, my mind is here. Or people will say it's here. But what does that really mean? What is the physicality? How does it can you measure it? Does it have any bearing on how it functions? Does it matter if my mind is here or here in terms of how I use it? Now, of course, we could say, well, it matters because if I damage my brain, it's going to harm my mind. That's true. We can definitely see some correlation there. But is it the exact same thing, damaging one's mind, as damaging the brain? Damaging the brain also has other effects. It doesn't necessarily mean they're the same thing. So one of the main problems with it, if we were to accept that, is that if the brain and the mind were identical, then if somebody looks in my brain with an MRI or some other kind of tool, maybe we could develop a better tool that somebody could look directly at the functions of the neurons while I'm still alive. But do they see my mind? Right? We could say, well, we can look at neurons today and have predict to a fairly good extent what a person is thinking about. That's true. We understand the correlation because of experience. Neuroscientists know that this particular arrangement or neural activity corresponds to a particular sensation or thought, because the person tells them they're having that thought when they have those neural correlates. But would we know that if they hadn't told us? And then we get used to it. But it's very different than seeing it. Otherwise, the person looking at it doesn't have the same experience as the person who's in whom that experience is occurring. So it doesn't really make sense to say one sees the mind. In Buddhist philosophy, anyway, without getting too sidetracked by this, but the point is that is not something you cannot point to mind and talk about it. You can't see it with your eyes. It's purely it's not that it's not a functioning or a changeable thing. It's not existing in some other realm in a different place or in some in a world that doesn't have any laws. It has its own laws that follows its own functions, but they're quite different from the physical world. So the basic point is what we call clear and knowing. So clear means that it's reflective, like a mirror. So a mirror is the best example of clarity. That whatever you put before a mirror, as long as the mirror is clean, it will just reflect it exactly as it is, without any distortion. So the mind is that it can reflect objects. But not only that they appear, that also is knowing or aware of them. So that is a fundamental thing, right? So in modern cognitive science, this would be the theory. It was called of irreducibility. We cannot say knowing can be reduced to something else. Knowing itself is fundamental in the same way form is fundamental. We can say, well, this form is obstructive. What is obstruction? Well, it's that there's something there that stops something else from being there. We can reduce it to parts in terms of the particular atoms, but in terms of reducing obstruction to something completely different from obstruction, it's hard to really get outside of that. It's sort of a fundamental understanding of something that has physicality. Now, with physics, there's a lot of talk about trying to break that down, and likewise in cognitive science, oftentimes there's a talk of trying to reduce knowing to something else. But anyway, in Buddhist philosophy, this is the fundamental quality of mind. What's what makes it mind? It is not based on a physical thing. Mind is related to physicality, especially the sense powers. And so to have an eye sense consciousness requires having an eye. So it's dependent upon a physical thing. But the actual nature of its knowing is not related to that physical thing. It's sort of accessing that. An example that's been used in actually now in Western cognitive science is the example of a prism. And so if we shine light in a prism, we see a rainbow. The rainbow wouldn't be seen, wouldn't appear without that prism, without that glass. But that doesn't mean that the light itself is coming from the glass. It has a different source. So that is the mind, and then we have mental factors. We shouldn't think of this as something completely different. I think the best analogy what it means to be mind and mental factors would be when we have water. So the nature of water, we could say, is clear. We could say clear and wet. Right? It has a fluid. There are several different qualities that just make it water. It wouldn't be water without those qualities. But within that, it can have other qualities. For example, it can be turbulent, be placid. So those are different from the water. It's not that you can have turbulence and then put it together with water and you get turbulent water. It's simply the water itself, when it moves in a particular way, it becomes turbulent. So likewise, the mind, we have the basic thing or stuff, we could say, of mind, which is this knowing, clear and knowing. But then it takes on different qualities based on the way that it engages objects. So mental factors just describe different qualities of mind. So they're more varied than simply placid and turbulent, but that would be, we could say, although there's no explicit mental factor called placidity or turbulence in Buddhist philosophy, that would make perfect sense. We could add turbulence, a turbulent mind, a mind that's very shaky and engages object in a very disturbed way. Whereas a placid mind, we could be very similar to a calm mind. So those are mental factors. So it's not as though we have a generality of saying my mind is such and such, and it has such and such factors. It's every instant of mind and every object that engages. So I could simultaneously have an eye consciousness and an auditory consciousness, and they are engaging their different objects in different ways. So if my eyes see something, see the color blue, and it appears attractive, that factor of sort of attraction to the object, that is a mental factor that's going with that. Whereas my ears are hearing an unpleasant sound and I'm experiencing it as unpleasant and as repulsive. That factor of aversion to the sound, that is also a mental factor. So there's two different mental factors going on at once. And then, of course, there's the mental consciousness, and at every moment could engage different objects. Now, whether it can engage two objects at once, that's a different question. We won't get into that. But at least it can change its objects constantly. So at one moment, I could be thinking about one thing, and a thought is an instance of a mental consciousness. And I could be engaging in a particular way. I could be thinking about my monastery, I say back home at my monastery, and different thoughts about that. And I can think of it with affection or with any other way of engaging it. Or I can think about being outside and somebody that walked in front of me on the street and feeling uncomfortable and seeing them with aversion. So it's constantly changing its objects that way and engaging them in different ways. So I mentioned thought is an instance of mental consciousness. So just to be very clear, mental consciousness, unlike sense consciousness, can be either conceptual or non-conceptual. So sense consciousness is by its nature non-conceptual. It does not have thoughts about things. It simply reflects them. Whereas mental consciousness can be either conceptual, meaning that it does not engage an object directly, or it can be non-conceptual in the same way as a sense consciousness, in which it directly, say, sees something. That's not something that most of us have an experience of on a regular basis, non-conceptual mental consciousness. But in Buddhist philosophy, it's very important. The only time we have that, most of us, is when we're dreaming. A dream is a non-conceptual mental consciousness. But it's a wrong consciousness. It's incorrectly engaging its object. Because what's appearing to the dream consciousness is a dream appearance, which exists, it's real. But it appears as a real thing, which is incorrect. So it would be like watching a television set, which is not, you see there's a television set, but thinking it's real. Like a cat or a child looking behind the set, trying to find out what's actually back there. So it's likewise with a dream. It appears as a real thing. So in that sense, it's incorrect, but it's a non-conceptual experience. In the dream, it's as if we're seeing something. It's not like we're thinking about it or seeing it and hearing it. We don't have eyes, actually. We're just dreaming. We have eyes. It's a strong aspect of the mind, of the mental cognition. But usually a day-to-day, when we're experiencing the world, we experience it conceptually with the mental consciousness. And conceptually means that it has an appearance we call meaning generality. It's a general appearance. It's like an image, a mental image that corresponds to that thing, but it's not actually the thing. So I think about my monastery. What's appearing to my mind is not, it's not that literally my monastery is appearing to me. Otherwise, I would see moment to moment all the different things that are happening. I just have a particular memory of it. It's like a static image. That's not as precise and clear as seeing it directly. So that's a conceptual consciousness. But all of these have mental factors. So just very briefly, we'll have to close this subject. But the mental factors are divided into 6 different categories. So we have all pervasive mental factors, meaning that every mind has to have these 5. And these 5 are first contact, meaning that with contact between the mind and an object. Mind cannot exist without an object. There's no such thing as a completely bare mind, because mind is aware of something. Awareness has to have awareness of an object. And then what's called attention, or actually intention would be first. So intention, well, I actually put it in better order. So we start with contact. The next one should be discrimination. Would actually be the best next step. Among these 5, they're sometimes ordered differently. But discrimination means that the mind discriminates one object from another. So if I'm looking at things, they appear to me as distinct objects. I see 5 different pictures on the wall here. It's not just a blur of color. So this is what the discrimination is doing, is dividing them into distinct things. Then there is intention to go to a particular object. So among those 5 pictures, I'm looking at one of them. So intention here is not like a motivation, and it's a conceptual, I want to do this. It's just the mind is guided towards something. And then attention is the next one. So that is focusing on that for even just a split second. Otherwise, if the mind was constantly splitting between different things, so rapidly that there's no stable appearance, then there wouldn't be any awareness. And then finally, feeling. So any moment of mind has to be accompanied by some kind of affect, either pleasant, unpleasant, or neutral. Just those 3. It's not something more complicated than that here. So those are the omnipresent mental factors, we'd say. They accompany all minds. Then we have the object associated meaning mental factors, which are 5 more mental factors that accompany most minds that have to do with the way that the mind accesses its object. It focuses on it. It thinks about it. It has concentration on it. And then it has some kind of analysis of the object. Thinks about it a certain way. I won't list all of those. It would become too much. And then we have what's called virtuous mental factors. So those thoughts that, or not just thoughts, it could also be non-conceptual, but a way that the mind engages an object in a positive way. So for example, with compassion is a virtuous mental factor, or patience, engaging the object in a positive way. And then we have non-virtuous mental factors, which are divided into 2. We get the root ones and then the secondary ones. So the root ones are things like greed and hatred, engaging the object in a negative way. The secondary ones are just specific examples of those. They're not actually different. So for example, among greed, or because attachment is the more basic thing, then we have different kinds of attachment. We have miserliness. We have excitement. Those are both examples of attachment, but they engage in quite different ways. And then among hatred or anger, we have malice and we have spite. Those are different kinds of anger. They engage in slightly different ways. And then finally, we have what's called changeable mental factors. So those that can be either virtuous or non-virtuous, depending on what object they engage. So one of the examples of this is regret. So regret. remembering a past action and thinking that I shouldn't have done that, that was a mistake. That is positive if I remember something that was non-virtuous and think I shouldn't have done that. If I remember something that was virtuous and think, I wish I hadn't done that, that's actually non-virtuous because it's causing me to, it's destroying what I actually did that was positive. And one mind can have many mental factors. It's not like it has just one or the other. We can distinguish many ways. We can say different colors. Like one mind could be very colorful, very complex. And within the mental factors, some of them are called substantial and some of them are called imputed, which just means that, like I said before, all of the secondary mental factors can actually be reduced to the secondary non-virtuous minds can be reduced to the primary non-virtuous, root non-virtuous minds. So spite is anger. It's just a kind of anger. So actually, we can reduce all of them into just a few of them. There are some basic ones, but then there are many of the other ones are specific examples, are more precise ways of understanding the basic ones. So for example, and this is something that sometimes people get quite confused about, so it can be helpful. I mentioned we have the object ascertaining mental factors. One of them is dumpa. We could call it wishing or wanting. This is not a negative thing. It can be positive or negative. So sometimes people think that in Buddhism, we shouldn't want anything. That's contrary to the Buddhist philosophy. That's a bit of a mistake. Wanting to be enlightened is a very positive mind. But then attachment is a particular kind of wanting. That is a non-virtuous mind. That has to do with exaggerating the qualities of an object and thereby wanting it in an unrealistic way. So that's when the mind can become non-virtuous. But in any case, so we can say attachment is an instance of wanting. It can be reduced to that. Whereas wanting is not reducible. It's among the mental factors. It's one of the ones that is called substantial. It's not that it actually is something else. It is itself just a basic mental factor. So that's a very brief introduction to that. Already a bit too long. But if you want to study more about that, there's courses on mind and mental factors. I think they have done that here. It's called Lodik in Tibetan. And if there are good books on it, there's, for example, Geshe Tashi Tsering, I mentioned last night, for those of you who were here, his series, The Foundation of Buddhist Thought. So he has a very good introduction to that. I think it was called Buddhist Psychology, but it's one of the 6 books in that series, The Foundation of Buddhist Thought. And there are many others. If anyone's interested, maybe you can ask me afterwards. We're already running over time. And the other ones aren't going to be any shorter, necessarily. Okay, so next we have the Four Noble Truths. So I think a couple months ago, I came here and talked about the Four Noble Truths, and I spent almost the 2.5 hours on the first truth. So now I'm going to spend 15 minutes on all 4 of them. So some of you know that the Buddha, after his enlightenment in Bodh Gaya, then he traveled to Varanasi, and just outside of Varanasi in Sarnath, in the Deer Grove, he gave his first teaching. So his first teaching was on this, the Four Noble Truths. It's the most basic Buddhist teaching upon which all the other ones are based. So I think the story is important for understanding the context. So some of you again might know that his first 5 disciples were his former companions. Before the Buddha became enlightened, he had been an ascetic for 6 years, desperately trying to find the answers, the freedom from the cycle of rebirth. And so he had gone to quite extremes of asceticism, torturing his body, trying to go beyond attachment, but he found that it didn't work. So his companions were doing the same thing, and when he gave up that path, they were disgusted and wouldn't talk to him again. So when he came back, at first they saw him and they refused to pay homage to him because they thought this is the glutton who eats. It's not something that they considered appropriate for a spiritual practitioner. But it said, first of all, among the five of them, they made a pact among themselves not to honor him. But one of them, Konyana, he mentally, although he said the words, the pact, he didn't mentally acquiesce to it. He still had faith in their friend, Gautama. So when they came close to him, they were overwhelmed by his radiance, and they could not help themselves except to welcome him and to make a seat for him. And so they asked him, "What have you done? How did you find the path?" And he said, for one thing, they addressed him as Venerable One, or Sedandempa, which literally means one endowed with life. Of the Sanskrit of that, I forget. So he said, "You should not address me like that anymore. You should now address me as Tathagata, because I have gone beyond this world." And he said to them, before he gave the teaching on the Four Noble Truths, he said, there are two extremes. And one is the extreme of hedonism, which is that somebody who they're seeking for happiness just without any hesitation pursues the objects to which they are attracted. And both he and his new students, they agreed that was not the path. They had left that life behind. But he said the other extreme is asceticism. That if you just deprive yourself of the necessities of life, that is just as detrimental to making any progress spiritually, because it has no benefit. He just said it's useless. It does not do anything except torture yourself. It doesn't accomplish anything more. It's not that by suffering this way that you purify, and thereby you are free of that. So he said he found a middle way between those two. And essentially, this middle way involves correct knowledge of things. It's not a matter of pleasing some external deity by how much you can deprive yourself. The point is to have a correct understanding. So to do that, you need to give your body what it needs to sustain itself, so that you can think about things and concentrate on them. So then he prefaced that, and then he gave his teaching on the Four Noble Truths, which for them was quite pertinent, because that's what they were searching for. These ascetics, they had a fairly clear picture that ordinary life was not desirable. Ordinary people went through their lives without finding true happiness, and then they experienced gradually aging, sickness, and death, and they were looking for something more than that. So the Buddha presented it to them as this is the way to be free of that. So the Four Noble Truths, the first one is the truth of suffering, which is essentially what they had to a certain extent recognized. The Buddha said, birth is suffering, aging is suffering, sickness is suffering, death is suffering. But he understood it in a deeper way than they had, because he understood that those are just the external manifestations: birth, old age, sickness, and death. And it goes deeper than that. That essentially, as long as we continue in conditioned existence, that's just the nature of things. There's no way to be free of that. So I mentioned it before, Buddhism doesn't talk so much about attaining invulnerability or living forever, because the Buddha's message was essentially that's not possible. If you're going to live in a body that's conditioned, that's born, you're going to have to die. But is it possible to be free of that? Well, then you have to find something that's unconditioned, that is not conditioned by ordinary cause and effect, the ordinary chain of karma in this case, which we say is mental cause and effect. So that leads into the second noble truth. Yes.
When can I ask the question?
Yeah, please.
So I was thinking about it, why aging is considered to be a suffering. Like, I understand sickness, death from a physical and a mental level. And I also understand like dharma pertaining to it can help us, through the sickness, from karma perspective, from death perspective. But aging sounds a very like natural process. Why did Buddha saw aging and said it's suffering? And how really can Dharma also help us in that regard?
Well, for one thing, you're right, it's a natural process, but that doesn't preclude that it's a suffering process. If it's aging is unpleasant for most people. Maybe when you're 5 years old and you become 10 years old, you feel excited. I'm 10 years old now. But when you're 30 years old and you become 40, it's a bit, I feel like I'm getting a little older. I notice some gray hair. And then I become 50. I feel I haven't really done what I wanted with my life. Things are passing me by. I'm starting to notice wrinkles. And I become 60 and I feel pretty much approaching old age now. And then what did I get what I wanted? And then gradually, body just becomes more and more difficult to live with. The things we once were able to do, we can't do anymore. And the people, our friends, start dying. So that it's a process that goes against the way that we desire things to be. We desire our body to be healthy, whereas it just inevitably moves towards a state of non-health. We desire our friends and our family to stay with us, and they don't. Either they die or we die. So there's a lot of suffering involved in it. And it's natural, but that is the point here, that the Buddha mentioned that what is considered natural, what is conditioned existence, is just by its nature suffering. There's no way to live a perfect life and be completely free of suffering and not have any aging or death or sickness. It's just the natural way things are if we're going to take on these kinds of bodies. So he said, is there some other state we can attain where we don't have to experience this, where we don't have to keep being separated from the things that we want? So you mentioned about how does spiritual practice help us to be free of that? Was that the question exactly, or the latter part?
Because I was relating it to, like, I can understand the sickness, dharma. Directly we have, that our dharma practices help us. And aging, of course, I can also understand, because it's a lifelong process. I was just not sure why, Buddha mentioned it as suffering, when he saw the four sights, when he saw it,
Well, it was a bit of a shock with this young man, in the story anyway, that he was young and healthy and had been surrounded by young people his whole life. And then to suddenly see somebody who was struggling to walk and his hair was gray and his skin was wrinkled. It's a major contrast to somebody who is young and in the prime of life. Most people, I mean, maybe some people who are very wise wouldn't see it this way, but most people, if they had to choose between one of those two, would choose the young body. And probably we often hear laments of elderly people who would say they look at the young people and I say, I'd do anything to be like that again. Which in Buddhist philosophy, that's exactly what's going to cause them to be reborn. That's the problem, is that we get old and we think I'd like to be young again. So then we do that again, but then we get old again. There's no way to be young permanently. Just not, but it's the nature of what it means by youth. It just means that something that has started aging but hasn't finished the process. So it's like we're trying to go against the nature of reality by gaining youth, but then not having it turn into old age. So the purpose of spiritual practice is to find something that isn't conditioned in that way, a kind of stable happiness that is not affected by this constant deterioration and decay, which is the nature of the physical world. We do look at things outside, these trees and the leaves, they'll just wither. It's just the nature of things. We can't ask, well, it should be different for me. I can take some kind of pill to make it different, but maybe you can delay it a little bit, but it inevitably catches up with us. Yes.
Because also, just to kind of thinking out loud from the question, is it also probably because it is the only one time that we encounter from our own lived experience that change is the only constant thing?
So
I mean-
aging is the only way that we counter that, you're saying?
Yes.
Well, yeah,
If
in
you
some
look at
sense,
it-
aging is a very good way for us to start to apprehend impermanence, because it's the most obvious sign of that for us. Yeah.
And if I may say something, as a person who has started the process of aging, it's only after having started it that I realized how much of my body I had taken for granted. And, I'm sure when I was your age, I would probably have not understood why aging is suffering, because, yeah, well, fine, you age, your neighbors play, and, whatever. But I didn't realize I was so attached to my body. I do now, because I could see that, what I did 20 years back, and I'm not able to do something, I'm struggling. And that feeling of, what should I say? At least it's there in me. Oh no, I've lost it. That feeling of loss, that feeling of even fear that, like my 30s are over, they're never coming back. That I think, maybe many people get it.
Yeah.
I'm like,
You also feel it once you had pizza last night. You feel it the next day.
Exactly. Well, that's actually a very good point. That is part of the Buddha's insight into suffering. That the things he also divided this truth of suffering. I wasn't going to get too much into this because it will take a while, but it's also important. Is that suffering is not just simply the things that we usually consider suffering, painful feelings. It's also what we call pleasant feelings, and he called this the suffering of change. So something that is pleasant tonight is going to have effects tomorrow morning that might be unpleasant. So that the happiness actually turns into suffering. And it both from the aspect of the feeling, like if we have something pleasant, we have a pleasant sensation of something we're eating. If we keep eating it more and more, it's just eventually going to become, first of all, boring, and then actually start to taste bad because we're not hungry anymore. But also that because we once enjoyed it, then the feeling of loss and craving for what we once had is much stronger than if we never had experienced it in the first place. Now, in ordinary worldly parlance, you might say, well, it's better to at least have it while you have the chance. And then you can, when you're older, you can reflect and remember all the wonderful things you did when you were young. But we have to look, does that actually work in that way? To people who spent their whole young life partying and having as much fun as they could, when they get older, they're more happy as a result. Oftentimes, it might be the opposite. The Buddha, his feeling was it's the opposite, and that's important. Whether it's true or not, I think it's important to recognize we don't have to just take that as dogma. I have to examine what he was saying, but that definitely was his message, that the more we engage in it, it's like salt water, and we just want more and more of it, but that doesn't satisfy us. Yes.
Mind or agitation or any other problem, is there a higher level of consciousness one could reach to heal the mind? I know, but that metaphysics has not been dealt with by the Buddha. He existed not one. He only gave a purpose, in the end, that only as a symbol. So, is there a higher, some sort of level that one can use to heal the mind? What is your?
Yes, basically, yes, is the answer. Right, so that the Buddha recognized that healing is a good term that he used. Right, that it's like he compared people to open wounds. People are like open wounds that they just go around trying to feel better, but everything they do just pricks that wound and makes it worse. So what we want to do is address that and heal that wound. And that he taught a method for doing it. And he said the method for doing that is not to just try to experience pleasure. That's not going to address the problem. So I guess that would lead naturally into what we just said. There's 4 noble truths. The latter two there. And the third one is the truth of cessation, which the Buddha said, he compared it to a state of health. It's attaining a state of healing from our ordinary experience. And finally, the fourth noble truth is the path to that there is a method for doing so. It's not something that just comes about randomly. He compared that to medicine, that his teaching is the medicine. So that's good that we touched upon that.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, given our
Time.
time, yeah, we'll have to move on to the next subject. But I think we give a very go ahead.
So it is, can you
Yeah,
just
please,
repeat
please.
the four noble
Yeah, four
truths
noble
just
truths, so very clearly, and to say it, we should understand that there's two levels of cause and effect. So we have the afflicted, or essentially the bad cause and effect. The effect being suffering, the cause of that being the second truth, which is the cause of suffering. Then we have the positive side. So the third noble truth is cessation, which is the effect, the positive effect that we wish to achieve. And then the cause of that is the path. So most of the time, most of our experience has been following this second truth, the cause of suffering, and thereby experiencing the result of suffering. We want to change that and follow the path that leads out of that, and eventually attain the cessation, which is the freedom from that. Okay, so the latter two topics today are related to each other. So the first one is called the three vehicles and the three scopes, which is two different things. So there's two sets of three, but we shouldn't confuse them. They're related. The three different vehicles, essentially the difference is that the three different vehicles are three different paths that three different people might follow. Whereas the three scopes, we could say, are three levels of development of a particular individual. We want to develop our minds through these three ways of thinking. So the three vehicles it's talking about, there's different goals that somebody might have in spiritual practice. Those of you who were here last night, remember I talked about this, that we have what's first called this Sravaka or hearer vehicle, those who wish to attain freedom from this process of the Four Noble Truths. They wish to achieve cessation, but nothing more than that. That's still a very lofty goal. And in Buddhism, it's considered a very worthy goal, but it's still not necessarily the final goal. So that vehicle is that path that they will follow, that will take them, that will carry them to that goal. And then we have the Pratyeka Buddha, or solitary realizer. So we say Pratyeka Buddha. Buddha in this context is not exactly the same as Buddha, like the Shakyamuni Buddha. And because there it's talking about a fully awakened being. Here in Sanskrit, the word Buddha just means to know something that is cognizing. So those who realize, that's why we translate it in English as solitary realizer. Pratya means solid, or prati. So they do this singularly. So they practice, they're similar in some sense to the hearers, but we say hearer, meaning that they listen to teachings. Whereas a solitary realizer, they're a little bit more advanced. So they go and meditate in private. And I mentioned this last night, that the result of that is what we often hear about, like a solitary sage. Somebody who they sit maybe in the forest or on a mountain meditating alone. Yes? Oh,
But he did all of that by himself.
well, for one thing, he didn't. I mean, in the final lifetime, yes, but he'd had other masters before. But also the Pratyeka Buddha also would. So you're right in that regard. But the point here is that Pratyeka Buddha, he may have fit in some sense. Well, I guess the main difference is that a Pratyeka Buddha would not have taught like he did. After achieving their goal, they just remain in solitude. A Buddha is somebody who comes back and teaches afterwards. But also in terms of the result of the Pratyeka Buddha, they don't achieve a result that's capable of doing that. They don't have the level of mental cultivation that a Buddha would have. So that's, what I was saying is they sit just in solitude on a mountain in the forest, and they don't teach much. But the force of their realization is strong enough that it affects others. People see them, and they spontaneously are inspired and might even have realizations by seeing them. So we may hear examples of this, of people who are just appear to be incredible sages, and but they don't say anything, or they may say very few words, but their mere presence has a powerful force for others. Whether they partake of Buddhas, it doesn't necessarily mean that, but that's the example that's given. In this context, is that they're fully freed from samsara. They've achieved this third noble truth, the truth of cessation, the nirvana, but they're not very active in teaching others. So this third
Do you
vehicle,
suppose there
yeah.
are such people around today as well?
In the Buddhist philosophy, it's understood that there are not, actually. It's understood to be something that only happens in a period of time when the Buddhist teachings are not extant. But whether we could say, well, what about places where the Buddhist teachings are not extant? In Buddhist philosophy, they don't talk about it that way, but I've often wondered. We hear about places where there was just some sage who people say, oh, he lived in the mountain and he was meditated all the time, and the people thought he was some kind of enlightened being. I don't know. I'm not sure. But anyway, in the traditional teaching, anyway, it's understood that the world the progression of time in the world is divided into different time periods in Buddhist philosophy, and that we're currently in a period where the teachings are extant. That Buddha Shakyamuni had appeared in the world, and his teachings are there. Whereas when that finishes in this world, then there will be no more widespread understanding of Buddhist teaching. But there will be particular individuals who had met the Buddha in a past life and are still cultivating that within themselves. And that is going to be Prateka Buddhas. They don't share this publicly, but in private they're meditating. So this third vehicle is the Bodhisattva vehicle, the Buddha vehicle, or also called the Mahayana, the greater vehicle. And this is when somebody wishes not just to achieve this lower result, but wishes to achieve the result of complete enlightenment, where they are completely free, not only of ordinary samsaric existence, but also of freedom from the limitations that bind us. So ordinarily, even if somebody has achieved these lower levels of liberation, they're still bound by certain restrictions, and they aren't able to reach others in the fullest way. Whereas a Buddha is somebody who can do that, who can teach to others according to their capacity. So generally in our school of Buddhism, so some of you might know, I follow the Gelok school, is a Tibetan school, and this is what the center is affiliated with that. It's encouraging everybody to follow that path. We see that among those three, the most beneficial is this third one, that it's the path of altruism, because it's not just focused on one's own development, but also on the development of others, and wanting to follow a path that will allow us to benefit the world in the most efficacious way. Then we have the three scopes. This was a teaching actually that was, I don't know, the word isn't quite invented, but was at least devised by the master Atisha, an Indian, Dipamkara Srijana, who's 10th, 11th century. He was Bengali. But he traveled to Tibet, so he was very important for Tibetans. He had been a teacher at Vikramasila Monastery in Northeast India, but he had been invited to Tibet to teach. And so he spent the latter part of his life in Tibet, clarifying Buddhist teaching, which had already spread in Tibet, but had gone through a very severe dark age. There was a period in Tibet in the 9th and 10th century when Tibet was essentially a wild land. There was no stable government, and things had really gotten quite bad. So they were trying to restabilize their country with Buddhist teachings, which had already spread during the imperial times before that. So Atisha came to Tibet, and he saw that there was a lot of teachings that had been spread about Buddhism from various teachers previously, but no cohesive understanding of how these work together. So some people taught one thing and some people taught something else. They didn't understand how it could function together as a particular path for a single person. So he wrote a text called the Bodhi Pradika, yeah, the lamp for the path to enlightenment, right? Yeah, yeah, that's right. So just a 12-page text, but it was foundational for Tibetans in their understanding of how to make sense of Indian Buddhist philosophy, of putting everything into a particular order. So that became very important later on in Buddhist philosophy in Tibet, of how to put all of the teachings into a stepwise manner that somebody can practice them. So Atisha outlined this as what he called the three scopes, the three levels of mental cultivation that somebody goes through. And so all of the teachings of the Buddha are aimed at helping somebody with one of these three. So the first one is called the smaller scope, which is when somebody thinks, they go beyond. So we could even say the smaller scope would be what ordinary people live their lives, which is when thinking just about this life. So people just think about happiness, and even it gets smaller and smaller. We could say people just think about today's happiness or what I'm going to achieve tonight, rather than thinking about planning for old age. So a lot of people don't even do that. So it's a very narrow scope, and it's thinking just about me and how my immediate pleasure. So it doesn't achieve a whole lot, and actually, in the end, this leads that person to experience more suffering. They don't think very broadly about how to plan for the future. So gradually expanding that, and then eventually expanding that to think about beyond this lifetime, to think about what's going to happen when I die. And if I do continue to exist, if there's something I can do now that can positively impact what's going to happen afterwards. Because if it's the case that I would continue to exist in some other form, and if that's going to go on indefinitely, then that's a lot longer than just this one life. And therefore, it actually is more prudent to think about planning for that future, rather than just thinking about what can I achieve right now for me. So that is the smaller scope of spiritual practice. That's the first step towards becoming a spiritual practitioner, is thinking beyond this lifetime. The next step is called the middle scope, where somebody thinks, well, if I'm going to be reborn again, many lifetime after lifetime, of course, I don't want to create causes to have some miserable experience in the future. But even if I have a wonderful experience in a future lifetime, eventually I'm going to have to die and then be born again. But I want to keep doing that again and again and again. Is there something better than just being born again and again? So that's when they start thinking about liberation. Start thinking about how do I be free of this entire cycle. So that is called the middle scope. And then finally, the greater scope is when somebody starts thinking not just about themselves. This corresponds to what we talked about before, the third vehicle. That they start thinking, it would be wonderful to be liberated from this samsaric cycle, but I'm not the only one in this situation. And it would be very nice if I could also guide others. And so thinking about attaining some state that will allow me to benefit all beings and not just myself. So that is the greater scope. And so Atisha understood that all of the Buddhist teachings fit into one of those classes, so categories, depending upon the context for whom he was teaching. And it's not that, of course, it's encouraging us to seek the greater scope, but the understanding was we can't just go directly to that. If we immediately think, I just want to be altruistic and benefit all beings, without first thinking about future lifetimes and thinking about liberation, then our approach will be quite limited. We will just be thinking about this one lifetime. How can I give people immediate happiness? But then what we're actually able to give to them is rather limited.
In the moment, living this moment well, and like sort of the future then takes care of itself, instead of constantly sort of having this I mean, it just seems so grasping, craving, like, I don't want to have a bad rebirth, it just, it feels like grasping. Why not live today, this moment, the best that I can, and then obviously because of karma, the next life or whatever, which is made up of all these moments, is bound to have a good result. Why would you not?
Well, what does it mean to live fully in this moment, right? That's something a lot of people talk about. Some people might mean different things from it. But is it the most wise philosophy to think that way? I think if I was to put it this way, I'll just enjoy today, don't worry about tomorrow. So I'll just, why, as we were talking about before, I'll eat pizza tonight because who cares how I feel in the morning?
Yes,
No.
live well from a Buddhist context. I mean, not live well from a sensory,
Right, okay.
kind of the pleasures.
But again, the question is, to what extent can we do that? Is the goal then to just have kind of an experience of meditative bliss right now? Is that necessarily going to be the most beneficial thing in the long run? The Buddha, he talked very strongly about what he called contentment, being content with things. But there has to be a distinction. When the Buddha talked about contentment, he meant in terms of essentially external conditions. There's not a whole lot we can do beyond a certain level. We can create the conditions for ourselves to be healthy, and he said that's important. As I said before, he mentioned that you should not just think about torturing your body. You want to have good health and remain in a state where you can continue living as best as possible. But beyond that, there's not a whole lot more you can do. If you want more and more food and bigger house and more money, beyond the basic requisites of life, it doesn't bring you that much more. So that to that extent, you want to practice contentment. But to think about my mind right now is just what it is. There's not a whole lot I can do about it. I'll just accept myself as I am. That's actually not the Buddha's message. He was very clear that we have to be quite ambitious about wanting to change things. It's not in a positive state right now. It's not where we want it to be. And it's possible to change that. So to do so, we have to think very broadly and long term. The Buddha would not have been opposed to the thought of retirement planning. He would not say that this is contrary to my teaching. You should just enjoy today and not worry about the future. He said, well, we should think very practically about how to build a structure for ourselves such that we can have the most possible happiness. Of course, sometimes when people say they want to live in the moment, the point is that some people get very caught up in worries about the future, and they don't actually experience today. They're constantly on the phone or somewhere else and not here right now. They seem to be distracted. That's not the point. So there's a distinction between those. Because when we really have very clear values in the sense of what I need to plan for the future, we can be much more practical and realistic today and not have all kinds of fantasies of attaining some kind of perfect experience right now, such that we never actually experience what is going on around us. We need to be very perceptive about what's happening in the moment and what's happening in our minds, but not to the extent that we thereby think it's contrary or somehow anti-spiritual to think about something that might happen in the future. Likewise, thinking about the past. Sometimes people think that as a spiritual practitioner, we should just forget about the past. We need to be here and now. But actually, the past is very important for learning about how to properly live our lives. We have a lot of experience that we can draw from, and we can learn from that if we think about our past experience. If we just don't think about it, I sometimes like to reference Winston Churchill, the British Prime Minister. He made a very nice comment about history. He said that if you don't learn about history, then you'll repeat it. That's very relevant here too. we keep repeating the same patterns over and over again. So we want to start to recognize what we're doing. And thereby we think about the past. And because if we're constantly distracted, we'll never think about the past. In some sense, we're too focused on the present moment. We're so much on the phone and in worries about something that's going to happen tomorrow. We never sit down and think, what did I do over the past year? How have I lived my life? What am I doing? With that, we can really think actually in a constructive way about the future, not just grasping at it. So that's what's being encouraged here. It's a much more reasonable approach rather than, as you say, a kind of grasping or worry about things. So we want to bring that beyond just this life. The Buddha said, of course, I don't know if he said this, but maybe he would have said, of course, plan for retirement, but think about also what's going to happen after death. That's just as important, if not more so, because retirement, we may or may not live to an old age. Even if we do, it may just be 10 or 15 years. The future life will definitely happen, and it's going to be a lot longer than 10 or 15 years. So that's something more important to be aware of and to think about what could happen afterwards. Okay, so those are the three scopes. Now we have Lamrim also, which I said we could take several years on. So whether I want to crunch that into the last little bit of time, I'm not sure. It might be better to leave it for next week. But very briefly, and I think I will just allow, I think the Venerable Keldon coming next week, I'll allow him the opportunity to talk about it. But it does relate to what I just talked about in terms of the three scopes. So I mentioned about Atisha and his giving this teaching on the three scopes. So a later teacher, Tsongkhapa, was about 400 years later. 300, whatever. It's pretty much the same. So he considered himself an inheritor of this tradition from Atisha, of this stepwise approach to the Buddhist teachings. And this is something that had been passed down from the time of Atisha and developed by later Buddhist teachers in Tibet. But Tsongkhapa developed it further. So he created what was called the Lamrim, the stages of the path, which was a way similar to what Atisha was trying to do, but much more broadly, of looking at all the different teachings of the Buddha and trying to fit them into various categories of different kinds of meditations that one can do to gradually cultivate mental development. And so it was based to a large extent on these three scopes. This idea that there are beings who are smaller and then middling and then greater scope. Actually, the outline of the Lamrim itself. Tsongkhapa wrote several texts on Lamrim, but the most important one, it's called the Lamrim Chenmo, the great stages in the path. It's based on this outline, small, middling, and great scopes. Some of you might also have heard that Tsongkhapa had a teaching called the three principal aspects of the path, which has to do with what's called renunciation, and then bodhicitta, and meditation and emptiness. So that is said, actually, Tsongkhapa received directly from the Bodhisattva or Buddha Manjushri. So Manjushri is the Buddha of wisdom. If you ever have a chance to read about Tsongkhapa's life story, you'll see that he was what we would call a mystic. Tsongkhapa was a great scholar and was extremely well respected for his scholarship, but after having established himself very well in that regard, essentially he went to a medium. He felt he was not satisfied with what he had discovered intellectually, and he heard about this teacher. Well, actually, the teacher heard about him. So there was a person named Umapa, Umapa is often referred to, who had, from a young age, been having visions of Manjushri, and he was essentially channeling it. That's what we would say today. And Manjushri told Umapa, there's this person named Tsongkhapa nearby, you should go and invite him. So he did that, and Tsongkhapa gave some teachings to him, and then Lama Umapa channeled Manjushri for Tsongkhapa, who gave him advice directly. and said, leave behind your life of scholarship, come and meditate in the cave. And doing that, gradually Tsongkhapa came to the point where he didn't need to rely on the medium. He could communicate directly with this Buddha Manjushri. And Manjushri gave him this teaching on the three principal aspects of the path. That became the basis for his teachings. Yes?
Just for people who are very new,
Yeah.
you may just say with that the three deities. I mean,
Oh, of course. Yeah. This is
there
Tsongkhapa
with-
here, on the main statue here in the middle, with his two disciples, Khedrupje and Gyaltsukje.
And behind the venerable there, holding the sword in the altar. Venerable to your right. That's Manjushri.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, to the left of the Buddha there. So the point of this story was that in terms of the Lamrim, it said that the Lamrim essentially was the main basis for it was the three principal aspects of the path. Whereas it was, we say, ornamented by these three scopes, became the outline for the text. So actually it's said that in a later conversation, Manjushri said to Tsongkhapa, I taught you these three principal aspects. Wasn't that good enough for you? Why did you have to add this thing about the three scopes? And Tsongkhapa said, well, this lineage came from a teacher, and I respect him greatly. I think it was very beneficial. So we can see that even when somebody, and this was Tsongkhapa's approach, the teacher is not the primary thing. The primary thing is the Dharma. So even if your teacher is the Buddha Manjushri, you don't have to necessarily do everything they said. You might find something else that is based in reasoning and makes sense to be beneficial.
When people listen
Yeah.
to paths like that, like renunciation is on the small scope, emptiness on.
Well, in this case, actually, renunciation would be associated with the middle scope. Renunciation means renunciation of samsara. And then bodhicitta would be associated with the greater scope. Emptiness would be associated with both of them. Because in both cases, it's necessary to meditate in emptiness to achieve the goal.
What do you have to realize to exit the small scope?
The small scope, well, there's no particular exit sense. There's not liberation, but it's mainly the practice of virtue that one recognizes for future lifetimes. The best thing to do now is to abstain from non-virtue and to practice virtue.
You have to go through the three scopes, right? You can't choose that one.
Right. Well, you can choose in the sense that you can think, ultimately, that's the path I want to follow. I want to be altruistic. I want to be able to benefit all sentient beings. But yes, you cannot just skip the other ones. You have to cultivate those as well. As I was saying before, you need those as a basis. That if we just think about altruism without thinking practically about how to take care of ourselves, for example, then we'll actually end up just burning ourselves out without having the real wisdom that's going to allow us to benefit others in a long-term way. So that's why we have to cultivate all of them, even if our ultimate goal is altruistic. It's not selfish to think about gaining some kind of grounding within yourself that you can actually be of benefit.
So that you can decide where you want to get off. And then you don't have to go to the second scope. You don't have to go to the third scope.
Well, nobody's saying you have to. But yeah. Yes. Yes. And Pradeka Buddha and Saravakas are both in the second scope.
Do they necessarily have to go to the third scope?
Well, there's different opinions on that, but at least in our school, eventually they will. Because this is the fullest extent that a being can develop themselves, and they won't just disappear. And some of the schools of Buddhism believe that when they achieve that state of liberation, their consciousness will dissolve. It will no longer incarnate. But in the Madhyamaka understanding, that's not possible. Consciousness does not just dissolve. And so eventually they will recognize that they've achieved only a limited goal. After being infatuated with it for a very long time, eventually they will see there's more to this. And they will want to come back and continue on the path. Okay, so I think it's best I leave that. And then next week, there can be more discussion of Lamrim, more broad way. So we were asked to do a little bit of meditation. We'll do that. It's not too long because it's already getting a bit late. So why don't we take one of the most basic meditations in the Lamrim? Because in Lamrim, all of the teachings are arranged into topics of meditation. So that one of the main divisions of the subjects in the Lamrim is, first of all, recognizing the value of our present existence, the present body that we've attained. And then the remainder of the text is how to make best use of this opportunity that we have. But the first thing is to recognize that opportunity. So that's a meditation, we call it, on the precious human rebirth, our thinking about what we have right now. And recognizing that, because we don't always take the time to recognize that. Why don't we start? Again, we'll just sit quietly for a minute. We've been talking for a while. And we can bring the mind into a more neutral and relaxed state. So you can start, well, actually, it was requested we can start with the 9-round breathing meditation. But why don't we first start just to count the breath? It's a good way to become stabilized. So just try as best as possible, don't force it, to notice the inhalation and exhalation around your nostrils, and see that if you can count 21 breaths silently, and stay as present with that as possible. Okay, so the 9-round breathing meditation is a way of manipulating the breath a little bit. Some of you might know, actually, it seems like it's quite popular nowadays in India. So it has to do with alternate nostril breathing. So what we can do is using the ring finger, okay? We close one nostril and breathe through just one nostril and alternate this way. So the most basic way to do this, there are different ways of doing it, but the most basic way is simply first inhale through the left nostril and then inhale through the right nostril. Do that 3 times. After we've done that, then to the right nostril and then to the left nostril. Do that 3 times. And then breathe through both nostrils 3 times. This is meant to bring the energies. This is an understanding of the subtle energies of the body from the side channels into the central channel. So I think just to remember, so 3 times in left, out right, and then 3 times in right, out left, and then 3 times breathing equally through both nostrils. Okay, so the meditation on this precious human rebirth is meant to counter our ordinary way of thinking about what we have in this life, who we are. So sometimes you might have the thought, I'm so unfortunate. So many ways that I'm unfortunate. I was born into a poor family. I was born into a disadvantaged family, or maybe I was born in a place where particular ethnicity that I belong to is not the one that is predominant, and I feel discriminated against. Maybe I was born with some kind of deficiency. Maybe I had some kind of problem with one of my faculties. I had poor vision, poor hearing. Maybe I had some kind of learning disorder that precluded me from having the same ability in school as my classmates. So I might feel that I'm very unfortunate in that way. I might feel I was born in this time in humanity's history, and maybe it would have been better to be born at some other time. Maybe nowadays things aren't what they used to be, or some other issue with today's world. It's so hectic nowadays. And we can become very depressed with this thought. So to counter that, we start to think about the incredible opportunities that we have. We can do with this opportunity. So first of all, we can think, compared to the life of an animal, how is my life? We might think, well, dogs look so happy. Wouldn't it be nice just to be born as a dog? Well, maybe I don't know so much about pet dogs, and that's maybe some argument could be made for that. You're pampered all day. But for most dogs, that's not the lifestyle. There's only a very, very few animals, so not just taking dogs, but animals in general, who are pampered by humans. For most of them, it's quite the opposite. So struggling day to day, not sure if you're going to have enough to eat, you're going to be attacked by predators, going to encounter some kind of adverse circumstance that you cannot escape, with no real way to be free of that situation. They can think of a mouse living its life, trying to find food and trying to find shelter, and not be kicked out of that place, not be attacked by predators. There's no opportunity to be free of that whatsoever. Some mice are luckier than others, and they do find decent source of food. But there's no way to be free of this constant fear of being eaten. There is no mouse that comes up with a way to build a sturdy house and to have an education such that it can move beyond its present circumstances. There's just there's no opportunity for that, and the faculties of their birth does not allow for that. There is no way to think in the way that a human being is able to use their faculty of thought. So we can think how incredibly fortunate we are to be free of that. We can think, how many sentient beings are there on this earth? Set aside the question of is there other sentient life in the universe? Is there some kind of spirits? We can just think about the number of animals versus the number of humans. And that we are one of the very fortunate ones, the very, very few, who are born as a human being. So we can take a few minutes just to reflect on that. The next step is to think about within the human realm of human existence, have we achieved something fortunate? Well, we're free from a number of things. Most of us right now here in India, we're not living in a land that is torn apart by war or famine. We're living in a land where there's been a fairly stable government for a long time. And we're living in a place where we had access to education. I think most of us here, if not all of us, were able to attend school. Some people in the world today still don't have that opportunity. And we look through human history, it was not it was the exception for most of human history to be able to attain an education. So most of us have had that. You might think, oh, it's so nice to live in a primitive environment where you don't have to worry about things, but we really look at the lifestyle that most people in those cases are leading. But would we want to trade that? We want to trade our ability to think and to reason, or simply sort of what's a little bit more like an animal existence, where we don't have really any thought to change our circumstance and to reflect and to look at different ways of thinking about things and different ways of what we're doing right now. We're training the minds, having the space to do that, having a fairly peaceful morning here. You can sit here for 2.5 hours without much distraction. You have a space to do this, think about, reflect on these things. And furthermore, that we're able to comprehend this language. Some people in the world live in places where they only speak a local language that's only spoken by a few thousand people within their small area. They're very much cut off from a lot of the inherited wisdom of humanity. Most of us have the access to that. We have incredible opportunities. And then specifically in this case, if we have some appreciation of the Buddhist teachings and the way that this leads to some creation of our ordinary suffering, we can think about the fact that we've encountered this. Many people never have these thoughts. They just continue to live their lives plagued by their ordinary worries, ordinary stresses, and just think this is all it is. There's nothing else to do except just achieve a little bit of happiness and pleasure here and there. Nothing more to life. We have the opportunity to reflect on this. And we've met a teaching that gives us something to reflect on. We can think about having that opportunity. Then the final step in this case is to think about, what do we do with this? We've achieved this human body that's so rare, and these opportunities, this some leisure time that we can choose what to do with our time, not just be concerned about fulfilling the basic requisites of life. And we've met some teaching that allows us to develop our minds in a positive way. So we can think about developing a kind of determination to use this opportunity, not to squander it while we have it. Think. This is countering the thought of depression, the thought of sort of self-concern that for me, these kinds of thoughts. I'm thinking, what an incredible opportunity. And can I make best use of this? Trying to develop a kind of determination to do so. That is the very cornerstone of developing a spiritual practice. A sense of urgency, a sense that what we have now, we've met this, but this isn't going to last forever. This is the confluence of two different changing things. We've achieved this body that's constantly changing and won't last. We've met these teachings that won't always be here. We might not always have this opportunity. So while we do, can we make best use of it as possible? I think that is good for now. Fairly short meditation. Why don't we do a couple dedication prayers? We dedicate the merit from this morning's teachings and from the meditation. Then we can have a break, and then we'll have question and answer, a little more informal. So what I started to do before accidentally, page 36. Due to the merit of these virtuous actions, may we attain the state of a Guru Buddha, lead all living beings without exception into that enlightened state. May the supreme jewel bodhicitta that has not arisen arise and grow. And may that which has arisen not diminish, but increase more and more. Okay, that's all. Thank you. So we'll have a little bit of a break now. If you'd like to have some tea, coffee. Okay, thank you. We only have about half an hour left, so why don't we just take maximum 10 minutes and about 20 minutes for question and answer. Yeah, so this can be a little bit more informal. Anybody is welcome to ask questions. Either about what we talked about this morning, and if not, anything else is perfectly fine.
So since it's a general law.
Okay, yeah, please.
How does one prepare to be a monastic?
How does one prepare to be a monastic?
If they are being
Yeah. important things in being a monastic is thinking of what we talked about before, thinking long term. Right. So if you want to be a monastic, like any career, we could say, of course, your goal is to be enlightened. It's not an ordinary career in a worldly sense, but we also have to think practically. So we have to think, do I have the opportunity in life that I can do that? Will I be able to find a place to live and people that will support me? Do I have the financial means if that's necessary? Unfortunately, it's not always possible to live in a place where we're completely supported. And how is it going to affect the people in my life? For example, if I'm married and have children, we have to think we can't just throw that away. Unless we're in a position where even if we did so, they have plenty of support without us. But even then, we have to think. We look at the example of Buddha; he did do that. So it's not in Buddhism. There is something to be said for that, but we have to be very careful. Are we really ready and prepared to do that? Are we acting? Because in some sense, it's a bit of a selfish thing. If we have people dependent on us, do we really feel that's so important that we really want to devote to that? It wouldn't be so nice to leave our family behind, ordain as a monastic, and then 2 years later disrobe. So we have to think: is this a long-term commitment that I want to make? But then beyond the practicalities, we have to think: is that the kind of lifestyle I want to lead? That's a lot. It takes a lot of reflection, understanding what it means to be a monastic. Sometimes people have kind of idealistic thinking about it. Once I become a monastic, then everything's going to be okay. I'll be calm and I won't have stress in my life. But that's not always. That's actually never how it turns out, at least at the beginning. I can say, having been a monk now for many years, that there are some things that I feel very happy to be free of. And so there is certainly that aspect of it. I don't have a lot of worry about finances because I don't need a whole lot. Worry about a relationship, and it's wonderful for me. I'm very, very happy not to care about having to make myself attractive to others and worrying about am I going to find the right partner. Am I going to have children before I get too old? I don't care. I know I'm never going to have children. And then feeling are we happy enough with the lifestyle of a monastic? Is it going to provide what we want? Or do we feel enthusiasm about studying teachings of the Buddha, about meditating, about teaching others? And if we feel that we could have happiness from that, then so I have to say that we're not going to be free of stresses. Certainly in the life of monastic, we have the issues of sometimes people irritate us. Sometimes other monastics treat us in ways that we would not think a monastic should behave. Sometimes we find ourselves behaving in a way that we never thought we would behave as a monastic. So those ordinary situations in life are still going to occur. But we do have the general freedom that most of the major obligations in life we're not tied to. So I think we could talk about this for again. It's a very broad topic, but I think the most important things as a monastic is to have a community of people and to have a teacher that can guide us. It's not that I think that we do see in some cases it works, but generally speaking, if I was to ordain somebody, I wouldn't do so if I didn't know that they were going to be able to ideally live with a community of other monastics. And even if that was not possible, at least with a teacher. If somebody is going to just live alone, that they won't have for one thing, the training to learn how to behave as a monastic, but also the happiness that comes with being with others. As monastics, we still need support. We don't have a partner and a family, but without that, we still need human contact. And if our only human contact is going to be limited to being with other lay people, that's going to be a major factor in our not being able to remain ordained, because we'll start feeling, I don't feel comfortable with all these people. They all do things one way, and I'm just totally different from them. And they don't share my values. So why am I doing this? It's like somebody who, would be very difficult. It's not impossible, but somebody who follows one religion, whereas everybody around them is following a different religion and their family is following a different religion. It can feel very isolating. It's very nice to feel that there's some kind of support, but especially as a new monastic, to have an example. You can't just read a book and say this is how I behave. You have to be around others and see how they do it, and gradually develop one's practice and one's lifestyle that way. So that's a very abbreviated answer, but I think that's the basic things to think about. Yes.
So I've noticed that in my life that I only turn towards spiritual practice when it's traumatic.
Yes.
The moment I become happy, I stop spiritual practice. Like I came to the center 5 years back when I was going through a bad time. Then I became better. I stopped coming.
Okay.
Now again going through
Okay.
again. So I know it's very selfish, and I don't know how to make it. I want to have a spiritual practice, but the moment I become happy, I stop.
Right.
How to get out of this? Because I've been observing myself.
Okay. Well, the first thing is to recognize it, because it seems like you are. That's the first step, and then to start thinking, well, if I'm experiencing temporarily good conditions in my life, there's no guarantee that they will last forever. And actually, if we know it won't, because it's inevitable that eventually some other negative circumstance is going to occur. And so how can I start preparing myself now that it doesn't occur again, that I can have a kind of mental, or not that it doesn't occur, but that I have the inner strength such that if it does occur, I will be prepared. I'll have some inner resource to draw on. So like we did it just now with this reflection on the perfect human rebirth. It's things like that. It's just one kind of reflection, but we can do these reflections more and more because we might recognize intellectually that's a more wholesome way to think, but it's not necessarily how we always think. So we intentionally cultivate a more wholesome way of thinking, habituate with that until it becomes more natural to our approach. So I think that initially anyway, it requires some level of support. It's like we can know that it's good to exercise and it's good for your health, but sometimes we don't exercise until the doctor tells us you're having health problems. So we think ahead of time, being proactive about it and seeing the benefit in this, seeing that they're actually, if we don't really believe that it's going to have a long-term benefit, we might not put the effort. But if you really feel that this is worth putting the effort into, and that we want to have a little bit of self-discipline to continue with that. I think just one other thing is that it can also be good to occasionally do things that we find inspiring, because that will enhance our practice. So we could have the opportunity, for example, to attend teaching for His Holiness the Dalai Lama in person, if possible, or to visit sacred Buddhist holy sites, things that will uplift us such that we gain some momentum, rather than just coming to this center here in the city. We might not see some of the amazing things that some people have cultivated in this practice in the past or are still cultivating today. So to spend some time with that, or to, for example, do a meditation retreat, we have some space away from everything. And then when we come back, we have much more force to integrate that into our lives. Yeah.
Sorry. Been a few days ago.
Okay.
With a few colleagues who were talking about Buddhism generally.
Okay.
And then one of the colleagues who's President current Tibetan, and the controversy that had affected and I found that I was disturbed by it. But I kept my calm and I didn't participate in that.
Okay.
But then they prodded on. And then they also mentioned, well, this, that she knows that what happened was wrong, but she would stand silently, support of the Dalai Lama. So what happened was, what came up and said, he stated mildly, because that anyone disparaging the name of His Holiness really brought in, and they have no connection to the world of books, and they're observers
Right, of
of
course.
the situation, which is a political situation,
yeah.
and so many.
Yeah.
So it is my guru. So that is my personal inner also exists for other people in a different way.
Yeah.
I just could not reconcile. I pushed it away. And the Rottweiler is right now calm, but it's like he's there.
Okay.
So I don't know how to.
Yeah, it's a situation.
I didn't say anything. I feel
I
like
think it's actually very good that you didn't say anything. I think, unless you really feel that you know the right thing to say, that's going to be taken in the right way, without inciting others' negative emotions, then it's better not to say anything.
My negative.
Of course, and your own. That if you know that I can't speak without getting angry, it's better not to speak.
And allow them to think that she's some kind of a wimp or something.
It's okay.
Oh, I didn't think of that.
You might know there's, for example, in the chapter on patience, Shantideva, he addresses all the different reasons somebody might get angry, and thinking about how to pacify that. So one of that, and there's the passage when he says, Koso Chudanam Layam. So anyway, he's saying those who denigrate and destroy stupas and images of the Buddha, I should not get angry at this, because it's impossible to harm the Buddha. Right? That really, the Buddha appears to sentient beings in accordance with their karma. And if His Holiness is truly a Buddha, then nothing anybody says is going to harm them. It's just that due to their karma, there's some obstruction in His appearing in a pure form. So it's unfortunate that they are criticizing Him if that's what they're doing. It's unfortunate for them. We should have compassion, but we have to be skillful and know what's the best way to intervene. If it's only going to make the situation worse, then it's not helpful. And it's certainly no reason to get defensive in the way that we would if somebody attacked my side, my religion, my belief system. Well, that's a good opportunity for us to start. We recognize that actually we have some clinging going on here. It's not just about a purely altruistic approach to Buddhist practice.
So does that make it like a attachment?
It certainly can be. It's not, again, we don't have to be so judgmental of ourselves, but we recognize that, of course, unless we're fully liberated, we're going to have attachment, and whatever we get involved in, even if it's a very wonderful thing like Buddhist practice or monasticism, whatever, we'll have attachment to that and have a sense of self. So as a Buddhist monk, I'll start having a sense of I'm a Buddhist monk, and people make critical comments of a Buddhist monk, so I'll feel defensive about it. That's a great opportunity for me to work with my mind. Shantideva also says, when we're really kind to everybody, the problem is nobody says unkind words to us most of the time, because we're always very kind. So when they do so, it's like a great opportunity. It doesn't happen very often. So we should take that, we should treasure that. It's like somebody without uninvitedly just leaves a treasure at your door, because you didn't have this opportunity to practice patience. And so you weren't really ever forced to practice that way. And then he goes on to say, and that what I was saying before about the destroying the stupas and so forth. And then likewise, those who criticize my Lama or my family, those who are close to me, I should think like I did before. And what he means is earlier, he was saying, we recognize that people are affected by their own conditions. These own people, it's not like there's an inherent person that just thinks I'm going to get angry. There's reasons we can think about why the causes for them thinking that way. It's very natural. I mean, I don't think His Holiness has done any of the things that people might be criticizing him for, but if he had, maybe it's understandable that somebody would find that to be unacceptable and would want to say something. So we have to look deeply at the situation, look at what is motivating people. And if it turns out that we can say something in a very skillful way that helps them and that they take in a good way, then we can do that. But if not, as I said, I think it's generally better not to say something.
Yeah. That I
Yeah.
don't have anything to say there.
Yeah, that's fine. Yeah, Shantideva says again and again, whenever my mind is affected by, and he lists all the different ways that the mind can be afflicted. If I feel prideful, I feel vengeful, I feel spite, whatever, I should just be like a piece of wood. It's a piece of wood. It's much better not to say anything at all than to say something that's harmful, or even that's potentially harmful. Then eventually we might be able to say the right thing at the right time. But usually it's better to remain silent. Yes?
I used to have anger down that. It's very less calmed down over the years, matured. And now I'm seeing there's a group of men who are provoking anger all the time, almost every day. I know that the cab driver, rickshaw driver, delivery boy, some other. I'm not that it's angry easily, misbehaving, don't show professionalism. And generally it's very hard, especially if you're a hermit. They don't like, we're against. I mean, I can't never go. I'm following what is ethical and moral, I'm following that. Being provoked almost every day, I'm getting angry. This is spiritual energy for me. And I know you're provoking. Very hard. I don't find that they don't mind. Ecstasy should not have any person. Small child, most of parents taught me. Tolerate what others are doing. Grocery delivery, rickshaw driver, I know it out. Right.
I think that although it's by no means easy, people might sometimes treat us in ways that are very unfair and inappropriate. We can't always change that. If we are in a position, as she had asked, that we can do something constructive, we might be able to. If not, what we can do is work with our own mind in that case. So we have the opportunity, although it might be completely unfair what the other person is doing, it might be completely uncalled for and unprovoked. The only thing we can directly deal with, if we have no means to counter that, is working with our mind. It's not an easy process. It's not like I'm sitting here saying, "Oh, you do this thing. We should, that we've all done this so easily ourselves." All of us have to work on this. All of us have these difficulties sometimes. That's part of spiritual practice. If it was easy, there wouldn't be much progress. Sometimes we have to have very difficult circumstances to force us to really cope and develop much more skillful ways of dealing with difficult
And
circumstances.
to protect from the environment.
Yeah, we can create a kind of inner resource such that the external doesn't have to bring us up and down as much. We can, within ourselves, we can remain more stable. Or developing that kind of inner resource. Well, essentially, the stages is the general stages of the Buddhist teaching that's relevant here is starting with ethical discipline. That's the foundation. And so we can't think, I want to develop an inner resource, but still go along with engaging in negative actions, like harming others. You have to make a firm decision. I'm not going to do these things. I'm going to have this kind of ethical basis. At first, that can be, again, very hard. If we're in a situation where it feels like it would be a lot easier if I could just lash out at people, maybe it would have some kind of short-term benefit, but in the long term, if we have a very strong confidence in our own sense of integrity, that will give us a much stronger basis for building that inner resource. Then based on that, generating concentration, which comes from doing some meditation, but also minimizing distraction. Right? It's a very big issue these days, I find, with especially with mobile phones. Not to put the finger just at one thing, but I think it's almost directly contrary to meditation, in my opinion. For many years, I did not have a mobile phone. And then even when I had one, it was you say, just a simple phone. Finally, it became this necessary, basically during the lockdown, because I was stranded in a different country, that I had to have access to information and contact. And so I eventually had a better phone. And then now that I'm living where I'm living now as a director of the house at Sarva, I have a lot of responsibility. It's just impossible to live without the phone. But I noticed that my concentration is not as good as it was before. And it's because of the phone. I know that's the main cause. So we can't necessarily get rid of that kind of thing. Most of us, it's just impossible. We would probably be fired from our job. But to try to make space where that doesn't infiltrate every aspect of our life. So personally, I try my best. It's not always possible. But I usually try to keep my phone off from about 6 p.m. to about 8 a.m. the next day. So at least during that time, of course, I'm sleeping some of that time, but I just know that I'm not thinking about the phone and what message is going to come through. So making space, and so I said the phone is just one thing. There are many other sources of distraction, but in general, trying to make space in our lives. Concentration can't come in the midst of distraction unless we're already very well concentrated, unless we're very highly developed. We have to start by making peaceful space. Then on the basis of that, then developing wisdom. So these meditations we're doing are primarily focused on wisdom, that we're cultivating a different way of thinking. But that has to be based in the former too. We can't just do the meditation, but not practice ethical discipline, not create concentration. So again, I'll leave it there, but these are very involved questions. I want to have, we'll have time. You have a question, right? Before you raised your hand?
I think when
Yeah.
we have a bus to catch.
Yeah, I do. I don't know which clock is correct. These two are different.
Yeah.
So we'll go till 12:30 on that clock. It's okay. So we have
It's 12:30.
It's okay. We can have one or two more questions. I won't be late. Oh yeah. Geshe Tashi setting. Geshe Tashi setting. Geshe is Geshe. I think you have the name, right? You can give to you. He had written it down. Yeah. Yeah, from Sarah May. Yeah, the Foundation of Buddhist Thought. We have it in the library, I think.
We have it here.
She can show you.
It's a 6 volume.
It's a 6 volume. Yeah, that's right. Of course. Yeah, please.
Yeah, so, Bodhisattvas come back they come back to help people, they take rebirth to
Yeah.
help people, and they like they can manifest themselves in as many bodies as they want, right? So then when there are wars and like really horrible situations happening, which have been happening over the past years, and it's just like, how come we have not seen when
Sometimes people ask that question, and I will say to people that any religion that claims that bad things can happen to good people is going to, basically be an object of ridicule, because it's just not the way that things are. Right? The religion has to explain reality based on what we can see. So it's clearly not the case that there are celestial beings that can just appear at any time at will. But what Buddhism is saying is that it is based on people's karma. The Buddha is unlimited in his power from his own side, but his ability to reach us is completely dependent on our karma. Otherwise, everyone would already be enlightened. But everybody who is suffering anywhere at any time, there would immediately be a bodhisattva that appears to them and leads them out of that. But the Buddha only appears to sentient beings in accordance with their karma, their karmic disposition. So it says, for example, we talked about this text, the ornament for clear realization, Abhisamaya Lamkara. What is it? In the 8th chapter of that, it's talking about the qualities of the Buddha, and it says, Halaiga Bocharbakyang, Sabamira Mitrum Tar, Ishin Sangi Junayang, Apamepa Sangminyong. So that's saying the king of gods, right, in the understanding of how rain comes about, the king of gods sends forth rain, but a rotten seed will not sprout. In the same way, the Buddhas are constantly there and present, but the beings who don't have the merits to meet with them, they will not experience that. So it eventually it will happen. So you ask, well, why does it not happen? Sometimes we see it. Sometimes in very bad circumstances in the world, some extraordinary person appears and lives an extraordinary life and makes change for the better. But it doesn't always happen. If it always happened, then probably actually we wouldn't have much motivation to engage in spiritual practice. So maybe although it's not easy to say this, maybe it's better to have it this way, such that we feel some urgency. There's that one opportunity we will have once in a while to meet with a Buddha. We should take that opportunity because we don't know when it will come again. Beings cycle lifetime after lifetime without guidance. But at the same time, we can think about there are a lot of positive things as well. And we see all these problems in the world, and it's certainly not to downplay them by any means. But of course, those are, as it's often said, those are the things that get reported. There are many beneficial, wonderful things going on too. The fact that it's being reported shows that it's seen as out of the ordinary. This shouldn't be happening. Whereas if people think the world shouldn't be this way, that's much better than if everyone just rejoiced in it and said how wonderful that these two countries are fighting, and let's just and sit back and enjoy the spectacle. That's not how people think about it. So there are positive things going on, but at the same time, as we see, it's very much mixed. That's how the life in the human realm is, and so we want to, as much as possible, that it's not like it's just fixed karma. The more that we can create the karma that the Buddha appears in the world, or that we can manifest in the future for ourselves, then the more it will happen. It depends very much on many factors. And so we have some power to do something about it.
And here's my question. I have for my mental factors, I have two questions. How do you start to meditate on mind, to like get in touch with your mind and what it really is? Because as a concept, it's very difficult, right? It's a non-physical thing. So maybe that's one question. And secondly, how do we use this whole Buddhist psychology? Mm-hmm. So I have some basis of it. One thing I understand is from emptiness perspective, okay, you start with inferential cognition and you go to direct. That's fine, that's understandable. But the whole also understand from Buddhist psychology, How do we really use in our day-to-day lives to benefit us?
So, first of all, how do we have some experience of mind? How do we start to understand mind as a non-physical entity? That's not easy. But the two things that we can use to approach that, one is intellectual understanding, as we're doing here. Because if we have a very strong concept that mind is a physical thing, and that there is nothing more than our ordinary or everyday waking experience, that is a major obstacle to having any other kind of experience. Our beliefs are very much structure our experience. So if we open to the possibility that there's something else through our intellectual inquiry, it will open the possibility that that might happen. But it still may or may not happen. It depends on a lot of factors. Some people are much more open to that kind of experience based on, let's say, karma, or just based on their, say, the disposition in this lifetime. And so if we don't have that, we can't necessarily force it, but we can create the conditions for it to happen anyway. You can't just decide I'm going to experience my mind or have some kind of spiritual experience, but there are certainly conditions that we can create that will make it more likely to happen. And so those include the things I mentioned before, is creating space and creating concentration. So in past times in the world, although I don't think it's necessarily the case that the world was a better place before, that people were more peaceful per se, but it is the case that things were a bit quieter most of the time and darker. People did not keep the lights on all night. There was no light. So there was more space for these kind of experiences to occur. Whereas when we constantly are bombarded with technology that is filling up these gaps between communication, and there's no room whatsoever to have some kind of spiritual experience. So if we start to create that kind of space through spending more time in nature, spending more time in quiet, even if it's just doing, as I said, kind of taking a week or two and doing a retreat, at least it's giving some kind of space. Then there's some opportunity for that to occur. The other thing is seeking out, as I mentioned before, about being around sources of inspiration, seeing His Holiness the Dalai Lama or going to sacred Buddhist sites. That will also kind of, you can say at an energetic level, make it more, sort of charge us in a way that might inspire something. But we don't want to approach it with the thought, well, I'm successful if I have a spiritual experience, and I'm not successful if I just experience things as mundane. It depends on a lot of factors, and those aren't the main thing. But if it happens, it can be excellent. It can actually open people to something different. But sometimes it can also be an obstacle. People get too attached to that experience or start thinking that I'm enlightened because I had such and such experience, and not see that actually mainly Buddhist practice or any kind of spiritual practice is a lot of hard work that's applied over a long period of time. So if that, in lieu of that kind of thing happening, then I think the intellectual approach is important, or even as a support with it. As for how to apply the mind and mental factors in daily life, it's not immediately obvious. Some of the things in Buddhism that are more useful to apply daily is, like, for example, mind training. You might know about this. That's very immediately applicable. The studies of philosophy are not that way, but in the end, it will actually bring insight into things. But we have to be very patient with it. We have to have some confidence by looking at it, objectively, that this, in the long run, this might actually help me to see things in a different way. And we have to ask a lot of questions. We can't just be complacent and think, oh, this doesn't make sense. Must be my inferior mind or something like that. We have to say, well, look, this doesn't make sense to me. I want to know why, and be a little bit aggressive about it. Then we actually will start to, because we will see how it's that is showing us immediately how it's affecting our own minds, and it's telling us something about our own preconceptions about things that we start to balance against those. Is my preconception right, or is the teaching right? And when we start to compare them, and there's a kind of conflict between them, then we notice we start seeing some change in our way of thinking. Okay, so thank you. I think we'll have to finish there, but appreciate all coming. I don't know when I'll be back here, but I think that Venerable Keldon will be here next week to continue with these topics. And if anybody has any further questions, of course, you're welcome to, I guess, contact Deepti or somebody else in the center, and you can see if it's possible to. I can try to answer.
See that.
Try my best.
Thank you so much for coming and teaching at the center this weekend.
Thank you very much.
So next week will be teachings, as Venerable mentioned, by Venerable Khalden. And that's on Saturday. We continue with the session 3 of the Grounds and the Paths teaching. And on Sunday, we continue with this session 3 of this series, which is Introduction to Buddhist Meditation and Philosophy. Thank you all for joining in. Thank you, Venerable.
Yeah.
The metro.
The metro was perfect.
This metro.
Whatever metro. Yeah. See,
Yeah.
you can scroll up. Let's see. Yeah. Okay. I think you can send me that question separately because she has my contact.
Okay.
Sorry, I didn't notice it before, but the question about Carl Jung. And,
Yeah.
of course, I can try to address that. I don't have time now, unfortunately. I have to catch a bus.
Yeah.
Can you read the question?
Yeah, the question is, the non-conceptual mind is it similar to subconscious? Subconscious.
If anybody else is interested in the answer, I can also send it to the group.
Why did you say Carl? His work?
The question I was asking about Carl Jung and his understanding of the unconscious mind.
Yeah.
So yeah, that's an interesting question. So I'll try to address that and send it in a way that other people are interested.
You could send it to us.
Yeah, I'll try. I'll just remind me. Have please send me a message because I might forget right now.
Sure.
Okay. Thank you
Thank
so
you.
much.